The ink was barely visible in the dim fluorescent light of the maintenance corridor, but Staff Sergeant Derek Morrison caught it anyway. A flash of black markings on weathered skin as the janitor reached for a high shelf. Most people would have looked away, dismissed it as another meaningless tattoo on another faceless worker. But Morrison had spent 12 years in Army intelligence, and he knew the difference between decoration and documentation. What he glimpsed wasn't art. It was a record, the kind only written in blood, classified missions and secrets that never made it into official reports. The janitor didn't notice his stare, just continued her methodical cleaning with the same quiet precision she'd shown every morning for the past 3 months. Her name tag read C. VALDEZ, and to everyone at Fort Braxton she was invisible. Another gray uniform pushing a mop cart through corridors where real soldiers planned real missions. But Morrison's chest tightened as fragments of that tattoo burned in his memory, geometric patterns that looked almost tribal but weren't, coordinates that seemed random but couldn't be, and beneath it all, barely glimpsable through her collar, what appeared to be wings. Not the polished wings of a pilot or airborne trooper, but something else entirely. Something that made his blood run cold as a single, impossible thought crept into his mind. Those markings belonged to people who didn't officially exist. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Carmen Valdez had perfected the art of invisibility over the past 8 months at Fort Braxton. At 34, she moved through the administrative building like morning mist, present but unnoticed, essential but ignored. Her slight frame and graying temples made her appear older than her years, and the maintenance uniform hung loose on shoulders that had once carried equipment most soldiers couldn't even pronounce. She arrived each morning at 0500 hours, 30 minutes before the base officially stirred to life. Not because she was required to, but because old habits died hard. In her previous life, being early meant staying alive. Now it simply meant avoiding the clusters of young soldiers who gathered in the hallways, their laughter echoing off polished walls as they discussed weekend plans and complained about training exercises they'd never understand the true purpose of. Her cart was arranged with military precision, cleaning supplies organized by frequency of use, rags folded into perfect squares, mop positioned at exactly 90 degrees to the handle. To casual observers, it looked like the obsessive organization of someone with too much time and too little purpose. To those trained to notice such things, it looked like operational readiness disguised as mundane routine. The tattoo that had caught Morrison's attention was hidden beneath layers of carefully chosen clothing, long sleeves, high collar, positioned fabric, all designed to conceal what lay beneath. But concealment was never perfect, and Carmen knew that eventually someone with the right background would see what she couldn't completely hide. The markings wrapped around her left forearm like a sleeve of memories she wished she could erase. Each symbol represented a mission, a location, a moment when the world balanced on the edge of chaos, and a small team of people who didn't exist on any official roster had pulled it back. The coordinates were real. Latitude and longitude of places where governments officially denied any military presence. The geometric patterns weren't tribal art. They were tactical formations burned into her skin with ink mixed from ash and blood in field hospitals that weren't supposed to exist. At the center of it all, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look, was a small black dagger crossed with wings. Not the traditional Special Forces insignia that soldiers wore proudly on their uniforms, but something else. Something reserved for missions so classified that success meant never being acknowledged, and failure meant never being found. Carmen had joined the custodial staff under her real name, but with a carefully edited background. former Army honorable discharge, solid references from supervisors who had been briefed on what details to omit. The personnel file showed a supply clerk with a clean record and unremarkable service. It didn't mention the 18 months she'd spent in countries that weren't at war, fighting enemies who weren't supposed to exist, alongside soldiers whose names appeared on no official rosters. She preferred the anonymity. After 8 years of living in shadows, the simple transparency of pushing a mop held unexpected appeal. No encrypted communications, no mission briefs that would self-destruct, no operations that required her to become someone else for months at a time. Just routine, predictability, and the soothing rhythm of honest work. But peace came with a price she hadn't anticipated. The young soldiers who filled these halls looked through her as if she were furniture. Their casual disrespect wasn't born from malice. They simply couldn't conceive that the quiet woman emptying their trash bins might have more combat experience than their entire unit combined. Staff Sergeant Morrison was different. She'd noticed him watching her for weeks, his gaze carrying the weight of recognition without understanding. He moved like someone accustomed to analyzing threats, cataloging details, filing away information for later analysis. Today, when she'd reached for the cleaning supplies on the high shelf, she'd felt his attention like a physical presence. When she'd glanced back, his face carried the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Carmen finished organizing her supplies and began her morning route. The administrative building at Fort Braxton housed everything from personnel records to strategic planning offices, a maze of corridors where classified discussions happened behind doors, marked only with numbers. She'd learned the rhythm of the building, knew which offices stayed late planning exercises, which meetings ran long, which conversations stopped when footsteps approached. Her first stop was always the memorial wall near the main entrance. Brass plaques honored soldiers lost in officially acknowledged conflicts, their names etched in metal that gleamed under careful maintenance. Carmen paused here each morning, not for any religious observance, but as a moment of remembrance for teammates whose names would never appear on any wall, whose sacrifices were measured in disasters that never happened rather than victories that could be celebrated. She wiped down each plaque with meticulous care, her movements slow and reverent. To anyone watching, it appeared to be simple janitorial duty, but her fingers traced certain names with recognition, soldiers she'd known in different contexts, under different circumstances, in places where their official duties had intersected with her unofficial ones. "Morning, VALDEZ," called Lieutenant Patricia Zhang, one of the few officers who acknowledged her existence with anything approaching courtesy. Zhang worked in logistics planning and often arrived early to review transport schedules before the day's chaos began. "Morning, Lieutenant," Carmen replied with a respectful nod. Her voice carried no accent despite her surname, a fact that had disappointed some soldiers who'd expected broken English and grateful subservience. Instead, they found crisp pronunciation and formal military courtesy that suggested education and training they couldn't quite place. Zhang paused in her stride, studying Carmen's methodical approach to cleaning the memorial. "You always spend extra time here," she observed. "Someone you know?" Carmen's hand stilled for just a moment before resuming its careful polishing. "I think it's important to keep their names clean," she said quietly. "Memory deserves that much respect." The response carried more weight than Zhang expected from casual conversation. She found herself standing a little straighter, looking at the memorial with new eyes. "You served?" "Everyone serves in their own way," Carmen replied, deflecting without lying. It was a skill she'd perfected over years of conversations where truth and security requirements existed in careful balance. Zhang nodded, sensing depths she wasn't meant to explore. "Well, they look good. Your work shows." She continued toward her office, but Carmen caught her, glancing back with newfound curiosity. As the morning progressed, Carmen moved through the building with practiced efficiency. She knew which offices required minimal attention and which demanded thorough cleaning. She understood the building's rhythm, anticipated foot traffic patterns, positioned herself to remain unobtrusive while maintaining access to areas that required her attention. The young soldiers who passed her fell into predictable categories. Some ignored her completely, conversation continuing as if she were invisible. Others offered perfunctory greetings, brief acknowledgments of shared humanity before returning to more important matters. A few, generally the newer arrivals, still adjusting to military culture, attempted friendly conversation that revealed their assumptions about her background, education, and circumstances. Carmen responded to all interactions with the same quiet professionalism. She answered questions without volunteering additional information, accepted casual disrespect without reaction, performed her duties without seeking recognition or appreciation. It was a performance refined through months of practice, designed to maintain her position while avoiding the kind of attention that might lead to uncomfortable questions. But maintaining perfect invisibility required constant vigilance. Every interaction carried the potential for exposure. Every careless moment might reveal details that didn't match her cover story. The tattoo was her greatest vulnerability, too extensive to remove, too significant to explain, too distinctive to ignore if fully revealed. Staff Sergeant Morrison represented a particular challenge. His background in intelligence meant he approached observation differently than most soldiers. He cataloged details, analyzed patterns, pursued inconsistencies with professional persistence. She'd caught him studying her movements, timing her routines, positioning himself where he could observe without appearing obvious. This morning's glimpse of her tattoo had clearly triggered something in his analytical process. She could see it in his posture, the way his gaze followed her cart down the corridor, the slight frown that suggested active problem-solving. Morrison was connecting dots, and Carmen knew that eventually his conclusions might lead to questions she couldn't answer without compromising everything. As she rounded the corner toward the eastern wing, Carmen allowed herself a moment of professional assessment. Fort Braxton housed multiple units with varying security clearances and operational responsibilities. Some conducted training exercises that were straightforward military preparation. Others planned and executed missions that carried higher classification levels. And a few, she suspected, dealt with the kind of sensitive operations that required the services of people like her former teammates. The irony wasn't lost on her. She cleaned the floors of offices where operations were planned that might require the skills she'd spent years developing. She emptied trash bins that contained shredded documents referencing capabilities she'd helped create. She moved invisibly through spaces where her former expertise might prove invaluable, disguised as someone whose greatest qualification was knowing which cleaning products worked best on different surfaces. It was exactly what she'd wanted when she accepted this position. Anonymity, routine, distance from the shadows that had defined her adult life. But as Morrison's attention intensified and other subtle signs suggested her cover might be developing cracks, Carmen realized that some kinds of visibility were inevitable. The question wasn't whether her true background would eventually surface, but when and whether she'd be able to control the circumstances of that revelation. Staff Sergeant Morrison spent the rest of that morning unable to concentrate on the intelligence briefings spread across his desk. The fragments of Carmen VALDEZ's tattoo kept reassembling in his mind like pieces of a classified puzzle he wasn't supposed to be solving. He'd seen enough covert operators to recognize the signs, the way she moved with controlled economy, how her eyes swept rooms in tactical patterns, the military precision disguised as janitorial routine. By afternoon, his curiosity had transformed into professional concern. If his suspicions were correct, they had a former Black Ops operative working as custodial staff, and nobody in command seemed aware of it. That represented either a massive security oversight or something more complex that required careful investigation. Morrison found her in the supply closet, methodically organizing cleaning chemicals with the same attention to detail most soldiers reserved for weapons maintenance. The small space smelled of disinfectant and industrial floor wax, a sharp contrast to the aftershave and gun oil that typically filled military spaces. "VALDEZ," he said, positioning himself to block the doorway. Not threatening, but deliberate. "Got a minute?" Carmen looked up from arranging bottles by size and chemical composition. Her dark eyes were calm, patient, giving nothing away. "Of course, Sergeant. Something need cleaning?" "Just curious about your background." Morrison studied her face for reactions. "Personnel file says you were in supply, but you move like someone with different training." The observation hung in the air between them like a challenge. Carmen continued organizing bottles, her movements unchanged, but Morrison caught the slight pause before she responded. "Supply Corps teaches attention to detail," she said evenly. "Old habits." "What about the tattoo?" This time, the pause was longer. Carmen's hands stilled on a bottle of floor cleaner, and when she looked up, her expression had shifted slightly. Not fear, but calculation. "Lot of soldiers have tattoos, Sergeant." "Not like that one." Morrison stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Those weren't done in some shop outside the base. That's field work. Improvised ink, crude tools, probably overseas in places that don't show up on tourist maps." Carmen set down the bottle and turned to face him fully. For a moment, Morrison saw something flicker behind her eyes. Not the deferential acknowledgement of a custodian being questioned by a superior, but the measured assessment of a professional evaluating a potential threat. "I think you're letting your imagination run away with you," she said quietly. "I'm just here to keep the floors clean." But Morrison had spent too many years reading people to miss what he'd just witnessed. The micro-expressions, the shift in posture, the careful word choices, everything confirmed his growing suspicions. "Look, if you're hiding something that affects base security..." "Sergeant Morrison, is there a problem here?" Lieutenant Colonel James Reeves stepped into the doorway, his presence immediately commanding the small space. Morrison snapped to attention, suddenly aware that cornering the custodial staff in a supply closet might not reflect well on his judgment. "No, sir, just asking about cleaning procedures for the sensitive document storage areas." Reeves looked between them, his expression skeptical. "Ms. VALDEZ has excellent references and has caused no security concerns. Perhaps your time would be better spent on actual intelligence matters rather than harassing our civilian staff." "Yes, sir." Morrison's face flushed with embarrassment and frustration. He'd been caught pursuing a hunch without evidence, questioning someone who officially had every right to privacy about her background. As Reeves escorted Morrison away, Carmen heard their conversation fade down the corridor. The lieutenant colonel was defending her, but his tone suggested he was also filing away the interaction for future consideration. Morrison's questions had created exactly the kind of attention she'd spent months avoiding. That evening, word of the confrontation spread through the administrative staff with the speed that gossip typically achieved in closed military communities. By dinner, Carmen had become the subject of speculation that ranged from mild curiosity to elaborate conspiracy theories. She overheard fragments of conversation as she cleaned the dining facility after hours. Young soldiers debating whether she might be a former spy, others laughing at the possibility that anyone important would end up pushing a mop. The theories were wildly inaccurate, but they represented a dangerous shift in how people perceived her. Private First Class Danny Rodriguez was holding court at a corner table, his voice carrying clearly across the empty dining hall. "Morrison thinks she's some kind of secret agent," he said with obvious amusement. "Like the CIA sends people to infiltrate janitor positions." "Maybe she's hiding from the mob," suggested Private Miller, grinning at his own creativity. "Changed her identity, laying low until the heat dies down." "Or maybe," Rodriguez continued, warming to his theme, "she just gets off on pretending to be mysterious. Some people need attention, you know, even if they have to make stuff up to get it." Carmen continued mopping nearby tables, her expression unchanged. She'd endured worse speculation during missions where maintaining cover required tolerating suspicion, mockery, and occasionally active hostility. The key was never reacting, never giving observers additional material to work with. "I heard she told Morrison the tattoo was just art," Private Chen added, joining the conversation with information that had been distorted through multiple retellings. "Like we're supposed to believe someone gets prison-style tattoos for artistic expression." "Prison-style?" Rodriguez perked up with renewed interest. "That would actually be kind of badass. Maybe she was locked up somewhere hardcore before joining the army." The speculation continued, each iteration moving further from reality while revealing more about the soldiers' assumptions than Carmen's actual background. To them, any woman with unusual tattoos working a menial job must have either fallen from greater heights or been pretending to heights she'd never reached. Carmen finished cleaning their area and moved to the next section, but Rodriguez wasn't done with his analysis. "You know what I think?" he said, turning to address her directly for the first time. "I think Morrison's right that something's weird, but wrong about what? I think you got those tattoos to look tough, maybe impress some boyfriend who was into that military wannabe scene." He stood up, walking closer to where she was working. "The thing is, real soldiers can tell the difference between authentic and fake. We know what actual service looks like, and cleaning floors isn't it." Carmen straightened slowly, her grip on the mop handle steady. "I'm just here to do my job, soldier." "See, that's what I mean," Rodriguez continued, encouraged by what he interpreted as defensive behavior. "You call me soldier like you think it means something coming from you. But respect has to be earned, and you haven't earned anything except a paycheck for mopping." The words were calculated to provoke a reaction, designed to test whether she'd break character or reveal whatever truth Rodriguez imagined he was pursuing. Carmen met his gaze calmly, her voice remaining level. "You're absolutely right," she said. "Respect is earned." The response wasn't what Rodriguez expected. He'd anticipated anger, defensiveness, or perhaps intimidation. Instead, he got agreement delivered with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested she understood exactly what earning respect actually required. Miller laughed uncomfortably, sensing tension he couldn't quite identify. "Come on, Rodriguez, leave her alone. She's probably just trying to make a living." But Rodriguez was committed to his performance now, aware that backing down would undermine his authority with the other soldiers. "I'm just saying, if you're going to wear military-style tattoos, you should be prepared to explain them to people who actually served." "What would you like to know?" Carmen asked, her tone neutral but somehow carrying weight that made the room feel smaller. Rodriguez blinked, caught off guard by the directness. What do the symbols mean?" "They mean I remember things I'd rather forget." The answer was honest without being revealing, personal without being specific. It carried enough weight to suggest real experience while providing no actionable information. Rodriguez found himself uncertain how to respond to truth that sounded authentic but remained completely unverifiable. "That's not really an answer," he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "It's the only answer I'm comfortable giving," Carmen replied. She resumed mopping, her movements calm and deliberate. The exchange left the soldiers feeling unsatisfied but unable to articulate why. Rodriguez had gotten exactly what he'd asked for, an explanation of the tattoos, but somehow felt like he'd learned nothing while revealing his own assumptions and prejudices. As Carmen worked her way across the dining hall, she could feel their attention following her. The conversation had shifted the dynamic permanently. She was no longer invisible background presence, but a puzzle they were actively trying to solve. Morrison's questions had opened a door that other soldiers were now walking through. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years developing skills designed to gather intelligence while maintaining perfect cover, and now she was the subject of amateur investigation by people who lacked both the training and clearance to understand what they might uncover. But the greatest danger wasn't that they might discover her background. The real risk was that their increasingly aggressive attempts to expose her might force responses that revealed exactly the capabilities she was trying to conceal. The morning shift change at Fort Braxton typically proceeded with clockwork precision, but today an unusual tension had settled over the administrative building. Carmen arrived at her customary 0500 hours to find Staff Sergeant Morrison already present, positioned near the main entrance with a cup of coffee and obvious intent to observe her routine. She acknowledged him with a polite nod and proceeded to organize her equipment, but his scrutiny added a layer of complexity to every movement. Each action now carried potential significance: the way she arranged supplies, her route through the building, how she interacted with base personnel. Morrison watched as she approached the memorial wall for her daily cleaning ritual. This time he positioned himself close enough to observe her technique, looking for details that might support or contradict his growing suspicions about her background. Carmen was acutely aware of his attention, but proceeded with her normal routine. She began with the brass nameplates, wiping each one with careful attention to detail. As she worked, Morrison noticed something that made him lean forward slightly. She was reading the inscriptions, not just cleaning them. Her lips moved silently as she processed names, dates, and service details. More significantly, her cleaning pattern followed a specific order that had nothing to do with efficient janitorial work and everything to do with military protocol. She was proceeding by rank, from lowest to highest, with special attention to certain decorations and unit designations. "Interesting approach," Morrison commented, stepping closer. "Most people just wipe them down randomly." Carmen didn't pause in her work. Seemed respectful to do them in order. Order of what? Rank and date of service. She indicated a particular nameplate. Corporal Martinez, 1968 to 1970, lost in Cambodia. Then Sergeant Williams, 1969 to 1972, KIA during Tet offensive follow-up operations. Morrison's chest tightened. Those details weren't included on the memorial plaques, just names, ranks, and years of service. The additional information about specific operations and locations came from knowledge that went far beyond what a custodian should possess. "How do you know about their service details?" Carmen realized her mistake immediately. She'd responded with information that required access to classified service records or extensive knowledge of military history that would be unusual for someone with her supposed background. "I read about Vietnam history," she said, but the explanation felt inadequate even as she offered it. "You read about Cambodia operations that weren't officially acknowledged until decades later?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Carmen continued cleaning, but Morrison could see calculation in her movements now. She was processing options, considering responses, evaluating the situation with professional thoroughness. Before she could answer, Lieutenant Colonel Reeves appeared in the corridor, his presence immediately commanding attention. "Sergeant Morrison, don't you have intelligence briefings to prepare?" "Yes, sir. Just noticed some interesting historical knowledge from our custodial staff." Reeves looked between them, his expression suggesting this was becoming a pattern he didn't appreciate. "Ms. VALDEZ, perhaps you could focus on the Eastern Wing this morning. Sergeant Morrison, my office now." As they separated, Carmen continued toward the eastern corridor, but the damage was done. Morrison had gathered additional evidence that her background didn't match her cover story, and his questions were becoming more targeted and difficult to deflect. The Eastern Wing housed offices for strategic planning and intelligence analysis, spaces where conversations often touched on classified operations and sensitive information. Carmen had developed a routine that allowed her to clean efficiently while remaining unobtrusive, but today she noticed something that made her professional instincts activate. Through an open office door, she could hear fragments of conversation that suggested crisis planning was underway. Terms like rapid deployment, communications blackout, and asset extraction indicated something more serious than routine training exercises. Carmen positioned herself to clean nearby areas while listening carefully to the discussion. Her training had included extensive work in intelligence gathering, and she found herself automatically cataloging details that might prove significant: personnel assignments, equipment requirements, timing considerations. "The satellite window closes at 1400 hours, someone was saying. "After that, we are operating blind for 6 hours. "What about backup communications?" "Standard military channels only. No encrypted burst transmission capability until the next pass." Carmen recognized the operational challenge they were describing. She'd faced similar situations during missions where conventional communication infrastructure was compromised or unavailable. There were techniques for maintaining contact during communication blackouts, but they required specialized equipment and training that most units didn't possess. As she worked closer to the office, she overheard additional details that painted a clearer picture. A training exercise was being planned that would simulate extended operations under communication difficulties. The scenario was designed to test unit capabilities when standard military communication systems were unavailable. Carmen found herself mentally reviewing solutions to the problems they were discussing. Alternative communication methods, equipment modifications, operational adjustments that could maintain effectiveness during blackout periods. Her expertise in unconventional operations had included extensive training in exactly these kinds of scenarios. "Ma'am?" Carmen looked up to find Captain Rebecca Santos standing in the doorway, studying her with curiosity. "You've been cleaning that same section for several minutes. Everything all right?" "Sorry, Captain, just being thorough." Santos stepped closer, her voice dropping slightly. "Were you listening to our planning session?" The direct question required careful handling. Carmen had indeed been gathering intelligence from their conversation, but admitting it would raise questions about her motivations and capabilities. "I couldn't help overhearing some of the discussion," she said honestly. "Sounded like challenging exercise planning." "You understood what we were talking about?" "Some of it. Communication challenges during field operations." Santos studied her more carefully. "That's fairly technical material for someone outside military planning." Carmen realized she was walking into the same trap that Morrison had been setting. Her responses revealed knowledge that didn't match her supposed background. But Santos seemed more curious than suspicious, creating an opportunity for different approach. "I pick up things working around military offices," Carmen said. "After a while, you start understanding the terminology." It was a plausible explanation that acknowledged her knowledge while attributing it to passive absorption rather than formal training. Santos seemed to accept it, but Carmen caught her glancing at the tattoo that was partially visible beneath her sleeve. "That's interesting artwork," Santos commented. "Looks like it has military themes." Carmen's heart rate increased slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Just designs I liked. The geometric patterns are pretty specific, almost look like tactical formations." The observation was accurate and perceptive. Santos had military intelligence training and was applying it to details that other soldiers had missed. Carmen needed to redirect the conversation before it developed into formal questioning. "Captain, if you don't mind me asking, what happens if the communication problems are worse than expected during the exercise?" The question served multiple purposes. It demonstrated continued interest in their operational challenges, while shifting focus away from her personal background. It also revealed that she understood enough about military operations to ask relevant questions. Santos looked surprised by the question's sophistication. "That's actually one of our main concerns. Standard backup procedures assume some communication capability remains available. What about signal fires or other visual methods?" The suggestion came naturally from Carmen's experience, but as soon as she spoke, she realized it revealed tactical knowledge that went beyond casual observation. Signal fires required understanding of sight lines, weather considerations, code systems, and operational security, expertise that custodial staff shouldn't possess. Santos's expression shifted, her attention sharpening. "You know about field communication alternatives?" Carmen felt the conversation spinning beyond her control. Each attempt to deflect attention had instead revealed additional capabilities that didn't match her cover story. Santos was connecting the same dots that Morrison had been gathering, but with the advantage of direct conversation rather than distant observation. "I read about military history," Carmen said, falling back on the same explanation she'd offered Morrison. "Lot of interesting problem-solving techniques." "Reading about it and understanding practical applications are different things," Santos replied. "Your suggestion about signal fires shows understanding of actual field conditions and operational requirements." Before Carmen could respond, alarm bells began ringing throughout the building, not the steady tone of scheduled drills, but the urgent pulsing signal that indicated genuine emergency. Santos immediately shifted into command mode, her attention turning from Carmen to the crisis at hand. "All personnel report to emergency stations," came the announcement over the building's communication system. "This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." The corridor filled rapidly with soldiers moving toward assigned positions. Santos headed for her office to gather emergency protocols, but paused at the doorway. "VALDEZ," she called back, "you should report to the main lobby for civilian evacuation procedures." Carmen nodded acknowledgement, but as Santos disappeared into the controlled chaos of emergency response, she found herself analyzing the situation with professional instincts that had nothing to do with custodial responsibilities. The alarm pattern, personnel movement, communication protocols, everything suggested a serious security incident that would test the base's emergency response capabilities. And despite every effort to maintain her cover, Carmen realized she was about to face a situation where her true capabilities might prove impossible to conceal. The emergency wasn't a drill, and it wasn't what anyone at Fort Braxton had trained for. A chemical spill in the adjacent industrial facility had created a toxic cloud that was drifting toward the base perimeter. Worse, the wind patterns were shifting unpredictably, making evacuation routes uncertain and standard emergency protocols inadequate for the developing situation. Carmen stood in the main lobby with other civilian personnel, listening to confused instructions from officers who were clearly improvising responses to a scenario that hadn't been covered in their emergency planning. The base's chemical detection equipment was providing contradictory readings, communication with outside agencies was sporadic, and the officers coordinating evacuation seemed uncertain about which routes were safe. Through the chaos, she heard fragments of radio communication that painted a clearer picture of the crisis. The chemical involved was an industrial solvent with respiratory and neurological effects. Exposure levels that seemed manageable could cause permanent damage within hours. Standard gas masks provided insufficient protection, and the specialized equipment required for safe operation in contaminated environments wasn't readily available. "All civilian personnel will evacuate through the western gate," announced Lieutenant Martinez, reading from a hastily prepared checklist. "Transportation will be provided to temporary shelter locations." Carmen analyzed the evacuation plan with professional expertise she couldn't suppress. The western route would take evacuees directly through the projected path of the chemical cloud based on current wind patterns. The officers coordinating the evacuation were working with outdated weather information and didn't understand how industrial chemical dispersal patterns differed from natural atmospheric conditions. People were going to die. She watched as base personnel implemented procedures that would expose evacuees to exactly the hazards they were trying to avoid. Families with children, elderly civilians, administrative staff, all moving toward routes that would lead them into greater danger than remaining in sealed buildings. "Lieutenant," Carmen called out, stepping forward from the civilian group. Martinez looked at her with irritation. This was a crisis situation, and civilian questions were the last thing he needed to manage. "Ma'am, please remain with your group. We'll have you evacuated shortly." "The western route goes directly through the chemical dispersal zone," Carmen said, her voice carrying authority that made several soldiers look up from their tasks. Martinez frowned. "The western route is upwind from the spill." "Not anymore." Carmen indicated the windows where they could see tree branches swaying. "Wind shifted 15 minutes ago. It's now carrying the cloud east-southeast, directly across the western evacuation route." "And you know this how?" The question carried challenge and skepticism, but Carmen could hear uncertainty beneath Martinez's tone. He was operating beyond his expertise and knew it. "Atmospheric dispersion patterns for industrial chemicals," Carmen replied. "The cloud will follow terrain features and wind patterns differently than natural atmospheric conditions. Your current route will put evacuees directly in the contamination path within 30 minutes. Martinez looked between Carmen and the evacuation checklist in his hands. Protocol said to follow established procedures, but his instincts told him the woman speaking knew more about chemical hazards than anyone else in the building. "What would you recommend?" The question changed everything. Carmen realized she'd crossed a line from concerned civilian to operational advisor, a role that would inevitably reveal capabilities that didn't match her cover story. But children were in the evacuation group, and following the current plan would expose them to chemical levels that could cause permanent damage. "Seal the building and wait for specialized equipment," she said without hesitation. "Industrial HVAC systems can be configured to maintain positive pressure and filter incoming air. It's safer to shelter in place until hazmat teams arrive with proper protective equipment." "That goes against standard evacuation protocols." "Standard protocols assume the evacuation route is safer than the building," Carmen replied. "In this case, that assumption is incorrect." Martinez was clearly struggling with the decision. His training emphasized following established procedures, but the woman advising him spoke with confidence that suggested extensive knowledge of exactly these kinds of scenarios. Captain Santos appeared through the chaos, moving quickly toward the evacuation coordination area. She'd been monitoring radio communications from the command center and had heard fragments of discussion about chemical dispersal patterns and atmospheric conditions. "Martinez, what's the delay?" she demanded. "Ma'am, we're getting conflicting information about the safest evacuation routes." Santos looked around the group until her eyes settled on Carmen. "Ms. VALDEZ, you were asking questions about communication procedures earlier. Do you have relevant knowledge about chemical emergencies?" Carmen realized that her earlier conversations with Santos had established a pattern of unusual expertise. Denying knowledge now would be obvious deception, but acknowledging it would require explanations she couldn't provide. "Some experience with hazardous material incidents," she said carefully. "What kind of experience?" The direct question required immediate response. Carmen could see Santos processing her earlier observations, the tactical knowledge, understanding of communication procedures, familiarity with operational challenges, and connecting them to current expertise in chemical crisis management. "Military experience with unconventional hazards," Carmen said, choosing words that were accurate without being specific. Santos stepped closer, lowering her voice. "What unit? What kind of training?" Before Carmen could respond, the building's ventilation system shut down with a mechanical groan that echoed through the corridors. Emergency lighting activated, casting harsh shadows across the lobby. The chemical detection alarms began sounding continuously, indicating that contamination was approaching the building perimeter. "We need to move now," Martinez said, panic creeping into his voice. "The building systems are failing." Carmen looked around the lobby at faces filled with fear and confusion. Families holding children, elderly civilians struggling to understand instructions, soldiers implementing procedures that would lead people directly into danger. Her operational training screamed that immediate action was required to prevent mass casualties. "Captain Santos," she said, her voice cutting through the noise with command authority that surprised everyone present. The ventilation shutdown was automatic response to external contamination detection. The building's environmental systems are functioning correctly to protect occupants. Santos stared at her, recognition dawning. "You're not maintenance staff." "No," Carmen replied simply. "I'm not." The admission hung in the air for a moment before Santos processed its implications. "Who are you?" Carmen looked around the lobby at the soldiers and civilians whose safety depended on decisions made in the next few minutes. Her cover was blown, but that had become secondary to mission requirements that were written in her DNA. "I'm someone who knows how to keep these people alive," she said, "but I need you to trust me and follow my instructions exactly." Santos studied her face, seeing confidence and competence that went far beyond anything she'd observed from custodial staff. Around them, the crisis continued escalating as detection alarms indicated approaching contamination, and soldiers struggled with procedures that weren't working. "What do you need?" Santos asked. "If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more inspiring military stories like this one." Carmen moved with sudden precision that transformed her entire presence. The hesitant deference of maintenance staff disappeared, replaced by operational command authority that made every soldier in the lobby straighten unconsciously. "First, prevent that evacuation," she said, addressing Santos but speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "Anyone leaving this building in the next 2 hours will be exposed to chemical levels that cause permanent respiratory damage." Lieutenant Martinez started to object, but Santos raised her hand for silence. She was watching Carmen's transformation with growing understanding. "Second, configure the HVAC system for chemical defense mode. Positive pressure, external air intake sealed, internal circulation only. Most military buildings have this capability." "I don't know how." Martinez began. "I do," Carmen said. "Where's your environmental controls panel?" Santos led her to a maintenance room that Carmen navigated with familiarity that suggested previous experience with military building systems. She approached a control panel that most soldiers would have found incomprehensible and began making adjustments with practiced efficiency. "How do you know this system?" Santos asked quietly. "Because I helped design the protocols," Carmen replied, not looking away from the panel. "Chemical defense procedures for military facilities. The equipment's been standard for 15 years, but most personnel aren't trained on emergency configurations." As she worked, Carmen's movements revealed the full extent of her tattoo. The geometric patterns that had caught Morrison's attention were clearly visible now, and Santos could see they represented something far more significant than decorative artwork. "Those symbols," Santos said, studying the markings. "What unit uses those formations?" Carmen paused in her work for just a moment. "Units that don't officially exist." The building's environmental systems activated with a low hum that indicated successful configuration. Air pressure monitors showed positive internal pressure, and the chemical detection alarm stopped their continuous warning as external contamination was prevented from entering the building. "Environmental defense active," Carmen announced to the lobby. "Building is now sealed and safe for extended occupancy." The transformation in atmosphere was immediate. Soldiers and civilians who had been preparing for dangerous evacuation were now secure in protected environment. Martinez looked at his evacuation checklist with new understanding. Following standard procedures would have exposed everyone to exactly the hazards they were trying to avoid. "Ma'am," he said, approaching Carmen with obvious respect, "your knowledge just prevented potential mass casualty incident." Carmen nodded acknowledgement, but Santos could see her calculating the implications of full exposure. Her cover as maintenance staff was completely destroyed, and her demonstration of specialized knowledge had created questions that would require answers. Staff Sergeant Morrison appeared in the lobby, having heard radio reports about successful crisis management. When he saw Carmen at the environmental controls, his expression confirmed that his suspicions had been vindicated. "VALDEZ," he said, approaching carefully. "Or should I use a different name?" Carmen turned to face him, her posture now openly military rather than civilian. "Carmen VALDEZ is my real name, Sergeant. But not your real background." "No, not my real background." Santos stepped forward, her training as intelligence officer taking over. "We need a complete briefing, now." Carmen looked around the lobby at soldiers who were staring at her with mixture of respect, curiosity, and confusion. The crisis had forced her to reveal capabilities that couldn't be explained by any conventional military training. "I'll provide what information I can," she said carefully, "but some details remain classified." "By whose authority?" Morrison demanded. Carmen met his gaze steadily. "By authority you don't have clearance to question." The secured lobby had become an impromptu command center as officers gathered to coordinate ongoing crisis response. Carmen stood near the environmental controls, no longer making any attempt to maintain her custodial cover. Her transformation was complete. Posture, voice, manner of speaking, even her facial expressions had shifted to reflect operational authority rather than service deference. Staff Sergeant Morrison circled her like a detective who'd finally cornered a suspect, but his approach was hampered by the obvious competence she'd just demonstrated. Challenging someone who had prevented mass casualties required delicate handling. "The environmental defense procedures you just implemented," he said, studying her carefully, "those aren't covered in standard military training." Carmen remained focused on monitoring the building's systems, her attention split between the conversation and ensuring continued safety for everyone present. Chemical defense protocols are specialized training, she replied. Specialized for which units? The question carried weight that went beyond casual curiosity. Morrison was pursuing specific information that would allow him to verify or contradict her background through official channels. Carmen turned to face him directly, her expression calm but carrying warning. Sergeant, there are questions you don't want answered through official channels. The response sent ripples of tension through nearby soldiers. Captain Santos stepped closer, her intelligence training recognizing implications that went beyond simple classification levels. Ma'am, are you suggesting your background involves national security considerations? I'm suggesting that some information is compartmentalized for good reasons, Carmen replied, and pursuing it through normal verification procedures might trigger notifications that create complications for everyone involved. Lieutenant Martinez, still processing how close his evacuation plan had come to disaster, looked between the officers with growing confusion. I don't understand. What kind of background requires that level of security? Before anyone could respond, the radio communication system crackled with external updates about the chemical incident. Hazmat teams were en route, but estimated arrival time was still 40 minutes. The industrial facility was struggling to contain the spill, and wind patterns continued shifting unpredictably. Carmen listened to the updates with professional interest, automatically processing information that would affect their tactical situation. Her analysis was visible to observers. She was evaluating threats, considering contingencies, planning responses with expertise that went far beyond defensive measures. The chemical dispersal is expanding, she announced after reviewing radio reports. Current wind patterns will carry contamination toward the residential areas east of base. Civilian population hasn't been notified. Santos immediately understood the implications. We need to contact local emergency services. Communication delays could cost lives, Carmen continued. Someone needs to provide direct notification to civilian authorities with specific evacuation recommendations. Morrison studied her tactical analysis with growing recognition. You're not just talking about notification, you're talking about operational coordination. Carmen met his gaze. I'm talking about preventing civilian casualties. Using knowledge and authority that maintenance staff doesn't possess. The confrontation was approaching a point where Carmen would need to reveal information she'd spent months concealing, but the developing crisis left limited options for maintaining operational security while protecting civilian population. Santos made the decision. Morrison, contact base communications, and get me a direct line to county emergency services. Martinez, coordinate with hazmat teams for civilian evacuation support. As the soldiers moved to implement her orders, Santos approached Carmen with questions that couldn't be postponed. Your expertise goes beyond chemical defense, she said quietly. You're conducting tactical analysis of developing situations, coordinating multi-agency responses, demonstrating knowledge of specialized procedures that aren't taught in conventional military training. Carmen nodded, acknowledgement. Accurate assessment. What unit trained you for this kind of crisis management? Carmen looked around the lobby at soldiers implementing emergency procedures with efficiency that came from having clear, expert guidance. Her identity was already compromised, but revealing specific details would create additional complications. Units that handle situations where conventional procedures aren't adequate, she said carefully. Santos pressed for more specific information. Special Forces, Delta, CIA. Different community entirely. The cryptic response frustrated Santos, but before she could pursue additional questions, Morrison returned with radio updates that shifted everyone's attention. County emergency services are overwhelmed, he reported. The chemical spill is larger than initially reported, and they don't have resources to coordinate evacuation of affected areas. Carmen immediately stepped forward, her operational training taking over. What's their current assessment of contaminated zones? Morrison consulted his notes. They're using standard atmospheric dispersion models, but the readings aren't matching predicted patterns. Because industrial chemicals don't disperse according to standard atmospheric models, Carmen said, frustration evident in her voice. The molecular weight and chemical properties create different distribution patterns that require specialized calculation methods. Santos stared at her. You know how to calculate chemical dispersal patterns? Carmen realized she'd revealed another layer of expertise that required explanation. Each crisis response had exposed additional capabilities that painted a clearer picture of her background. Hazardous material assessment was part of my training, she said. What kind of training includes atmospheric chemistry, environmental defense systems, crisis coordination, and tactical analysis? Morrison demanded. Carmen looked at him for a long moment, calculating risks and benefits of full disclosure. The developing crisis was beyond the capabilities of base personnel. Civilian authorities were overwhelmed, and her expertise might be the difference between successful containment and regional disaster. The kind of training provided to people who handle situations that don't officially happen, she said finally. Santos felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Black operations. Carmen didn't confirm or deny, but her silence was answer enough. Jesus, Martinez whispered, returning from his coordination efforts. You're talking about classified operations, covert missions. I'm talking about preventing chemical contamination from reaching civilian population centers, Carmen replied, redirecting attention to immediate priorities, which requires someone to coordinate proper dispersal calculations and provide accurate evacuation guidance to local authorities. Morrison looked between her and the radio communication equipment. You're volunteering to provide technical expertise to civilian emergency services. I'm volunteering to do whatever keeps people safe. Santos studied Carmen's expression, seeing determination that went beyond professional obligation. This isn't just about the current crisis. This is about who you are. Carmen nodded slowly. This is about who I am. The admission hung in the air as soldiers processed what they were witnessing. The woman they'd ignored for months, dismissed as custodial staff, was revealed as someone with expertise in exactly the kind of crisis they were facing. Ma'am, Martinez said carefully, if you can help coordinate proper emergency response, we need you to do that. Carmen looked around at faces that now showed respect instead of casual dismissal. I'll need access to communication equipment and coordination authority. Done, Santos said immediately. Morrison, patch her through to county emergency coordination, whatever she needs. As Carmen moved toward the communication station, Morrison caught Santos's arm. Are we sure about this? We're giving someone with unknown background access to emergency coordination. Santos watched Carmen efficiently configuring communication equipment with familiarity that suggested extensive experience. Look at what she's already accomplished. She prevented mass casualties, secured the building, and provided tactical analysis that's proven accurate. Her background might be classified, but her competence is obvious. Carmen's voice carried clearly across the lobby as she began coordinating with external agencies. Her tone was professional, authoritative, carrying expertise that commanded immediate respect from emergency services personnel who had been struggling with inadequate information and resources. County emergency, this is Fort Braxton coordination. I have specialized expertise in chemical dispersal analysis and can provide accurate contamination zone predictions for your evacuation planning. The response was immediate relief from overwhelmed civilian authorities. Fort Braxton, we need all available technical support. Current dispersal models aren't matching field observations. Confirmed. Industrial solvents require different calculation methods. I can provide accurate zone predictions and evacuation timing recommendations. As Carmen began providing technical guidance that was clearly beyond normal military capabilities, soldiers in the lobby exchanged glances that mixed respect with growing curiosity about her true background. Morrison moved closer to Santos, his voice low. Those aren't military procedures she's using. That's specialized training in crisis management that goes beyond anything I've seen. Santos nodded, watching Carmen coordinate complex multi-agency response with expertise that suggested extensive experience in exactly these kinds of situations. The question, she said quietly, is whether we're looking at someone who retired from black operations or someone who's still active and working undercover. The communication center had become Carmen's domain as she coordinated chemical crisis response with competence that left no doubt about her professional background. Her voice carried across multiple radio frequencies, providing guidance to hazmat teams, directing civilian evacuation procedures, and calculating dispersal patterns with precision that impressed even specialized emergency response personnel. Staff Sergeant Morrison stood nearby, listening to conversations that revealed expertise far beyond anything covered in conventional military training. Carmen was using terminology and procedures that belonged to communities he'd heard rumors about but never directly encountered. Hazmat Team Alpha, your approach vector needs adjustment, Carmen was saying into the radio headset. Chemical concentration at grid reference 3 Ortvorsev 221 exceeds safe levels for standard protective equipment. Recommend alternate route through Sector 7 with Level A protection protocols. The response crackled through the speakers. Fort Braxton, how are you calculating concentration levels? Our field readings show different patterns. Using modified atmospheric dispersion algorithms that account for molecular weight and terrain interaction effects, Carmen replied. Standard models underestimate accumulation in low-lying areas by approximately 30% for this chemical class. Captain Santos approached Morrison, her expression troubled. Those aren't procedures taught in any military school I know about. Morrison nodded, studying Carmen's efficient management of crisis coordination. She's not just familiar with emergency protocols, she's creating them in real time based on expertise that suggests extensive field experience. As they watched, Carmen shifted to another communication frequency, her tone changing subtly as she addressed what appeared to be a different type of contact. Control, this is Spectre 7 providing emergency technical support for civilian chemical incident. Request authorization for full coordination protocols understanding emergency powers. The response came immediately, but through encrypted communication that rendered it unintelligible to anyone without proper decryption equipment. Carmen listened for several seconds, then responded with what appeared to be authentication codes. Confirmed, emergency authorization active, will maintain coordination until specialized teams arrive. Santos and Morrison exchanged glances. Spectre 7 wasn't any call sign they recognized, and the authorization procedure suggested communication with agencies that operated outside normal military chains of command. Lieutenant Martinez joined them, his expression reflecting the same confusion they were experiencing. Ma'am, who is she talking to? Those aren't base communication protocols. Before Santos could respond, Carmen removed her headset and turned toward them. Her transformation was now complete. Every trace of maintenance worker deference had been replaced by operational authority that commanded immediate attention. Specialized response teams are en route, she announced. Estimated arrival 35 minutes. Chemical containment will be achieved within 2 hours, and civilian evacuation is proceeding according to updated safety calculations. Morrison stepped forward, his investigation instincts fully engaged. Ma'am, we need to discuss your background and current authorization status. Carmen met his gaze calmly. I understand your concerns, Sergeant, but some information remains compartmentalized. By whose authority? Carmen pulled a small device from her pocket that none of them had seen before. It resembled a standard military communication unit, but with additional features that suggested specialized modification. She activated it briefly, and a series of codes appeared on the display. Authorization Tango 77 Alpha, she said, showing them the screen. Emergency Operational Authority under National Security Directive 51. Santos stared at the device. National Security Directive 51 dealt with continuity of government and emergency powers that went far beyond normal military authority. Ma'am, that directive covers operations during national emergencies or threats to government continuity. Chemical incidents affecting civilian populations fall under expanded interpretation during current threat assessment levels, Carmen replied. Morrison leaned closer to examine the authorization device. I've never seen equipment like that issued to military personnel. Because it isn't issued to military personnel, Carmen said simply. The implication hit them simultaneously. Carmen wasn't military, at least not in any conventional sense. Her expertise, equipment, and authorization suggested she belonged to an entirely different community of government operators. What agency? Santos asked directly. Carmen hesitated for the first time since the crisis began. Agencies that handle situations requiring specialized expertise and authority outside normal jurisdictional limitations. Martinez looked confused. Are you talking about CIA, NSA, some other intelligence agency? I'm talking about capabilities that exist to address problems when conventional resources aren't adequate, Carmen replied, deflecting specific identification while acknowledging the general category. The radio crackled with updates from emergency response teams, and Carmen immediately shifted back to coordination duties. But her previous responses had provided enough information for Santos to begin understanding the broader picture. Morrison, Santos said quietly, check base security files for any notation about assigned personnel with special status or monitoring requirements. As Morrison moved toward the security station, Santos approached Carmen with questions that required immediate answers. Ma'am, if you're operating under federal emergency authority, why were you working custodial positions for the past 8 months? Carmen continued monitoring radio communications while responding. Cover assignments serve multiple purposes: maintain operational readiness, provide placement for personnel between assignments, enable monitoring of security status at military installations. You've been conducting surveillance on base personnel and operations? I've been maintaining awareness of security status and operational capabilities, Carmen corrected. Passive observation, not active intelligence gathering. Santos processed this distinction, realizing it suggested Carmen's presence had been official but covert. Someone assigned you to monitor Fort Braxton? Someone assigned me to maintain readiness while providing discreet oversight of installation security. Morrison returned with printouts from security files, his expression indicating he'd found significant information. Captain, there's a classified notation in base security records about special status personnel with independent authority assigned to custodial positions. He showed them the document, which contained heavily redacted information, but confirmed that Carmen's presence had been officially authorized at levels above base command. The authorization comes from Defense Department Special Access programs. Morrison continued, classification level above our access, but confirming that her assignment here was legitimate. Santos studied the documents, then looked at Carmen with new understanding. You weren't hiding here. You were assigned here. Carmen nodded. Temporary assignment during operational transition. The custodial position provided cover and allowed assessment of base security procedures. And today's crisis demonstrated why specialized personnel are positioned at strategic installations, Carmen replied. Conventional emergency response was inadequate for the chemical incident. Specialized expertise prevented what could have become a regional disaster. The radio interrupted their conversation with updates, indicating that specialized response teams were arriving ahead of schedule. Carmen coordinated their integration into ongoing emergency operations with efficiency that confirmed her authority over the entire response effort. As crisis coordination continued, soldiers throughout the lobby watched someone they'd dismissed for months, directing complex operations with expertise that belonged to the highest levels of government emergency response. Morrison approached Santos one final time. Captain, we're looking at someone with authority and capabilities that go beyond anything in normal military structure. Santos nodded, watching Carmen coordinate multi-agency response to a chemical emergency that could have caused massive civilian casualties. The question is whether we're supposed to know about this, or whether the crisis forced disclosure of information that was supposed to remain classified. Carmen looked up from the communication equipment, her expression suggesting she'd heard their conversation. Some information becomes declassified by operational necessity, she said. Today's events required capabilities that couldn't be provided while maintaining complete cover. She paused, studying their faces with assessment that seemed both professional and personal. Your discretion regarding details of my background and capabilities would be appreciated. Santos understood immediately. Carmen was asking them to maintain operational security about information that had been revealed through emergency necessity, rather than official authorization. Understood, ma'am, Santos replied, but we'd like to know who we're really working with. Carmen smiled for the first time since the crisis began, an expression that showed both relief and respect for soldiers who had earned her trust through competence and professionalism. You're working with someone who takes care of problems that don't officially exist, she said, and who's been impressed by the capabilities and character of personnel assigned to Fort Braxton. The compliment carried weight that went beyond casual observation. Carmen had spent months evaluating their installation, and her assessment would likely influence decisions made at levels they couldn't imagine. As specialized response teams took over chemical containment operations and the immediate crisis passed, soldiers in the lobby found themselves looking at Carmen VALDEZ with respect that came from witnessing competence under pressure rather than recognition of rank or title. Morrison approached her as communication duties wound down. Ma'am, I owe you an apology for questioning your background. Carmen looked at him with understanding rather than satisfaction. You were doing your job, Sergeant. Good intelligence personnel ask questions when they observe inconsistencies. Still, I should have approached it differently. Your approach was professional and appropriate, Carmen replied. The only issue was that you were investigating someone whose background couldn't be revealed through normal channels. Santos joined their conversation, her curiosity still evident. Will you be remaining at Fort Braxton? Carmen considered the question carefully. My assignment here has been completed. Today's events demonstrated that base personnel can handle complex emergencies with appropriate support and guidance. The response suggested that Carmen's evaluation of Fort Braxton had been positive, and her presence was no longer required for whatever assessment she'd been conducting. As emergency response operations concluded and base personnel began returning to normal duties, Carmen began packing the communication equipment with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to custodial supplies. But now every soldier who passed her offered respectful acknowledgement rather than casual dismissal. Word had spread throughout the installation about the janitor who had revealed herself to be something far more significant, and her transformation from invisible maintenance worker to crisis coordinator would become part of Fort Braxton's institutional memory. The woman they'd ignored for 8 months was revealed as someone whose presence had been protecting them all along. Word spread through Fort Braxton with the speed that only military installations could achieve when something extraordinary occurred. By evening chow, every soldier on base had heard some version of the story. The janitor who'd coordinated emergency response, prevented mass casualties, and revealed herself to be something far beyond what anyone had imagined. Carmen had returned to her quarters in the civilian housing area, but sleep proved elusive. The events of the day had shattered 8 months of carefully maintained cover, and she found herself processing the implications of full exposure. Tomorrow would bring questions from base command, formal debriefings, and likely reassignment to a different cover position at a different installation. She sat on the edge of her bed, looking at the tactical communication device that had confirmed her authority during the crisis. Its encrypted display showed multiple messages from her handlers, requesting status reports and operational summaries. The chemical incident had forced disclosure of capabilities that were supposed to remain compartmentalized, creating complications that would ripple through several levels of the national security apparatus. A knock at her door interrupted her contemplation. Carmen checked the time. 2147 hours, well past normal visiting hours for civilian housing. She approached the door cautiously, her operational training automatically assessing potential threats. Through the peephole, she saw Staff Sergeant Morrison standing alone on her doorstep, his posture formal but not threatening. He was in dress uniform rather than duty clothes, which suggested this visit carried official significance. Carmen opened the door, maintaining professional distance. "Sergeant Morrison, this is unexpected." Morrison came to attention, his expression serious but respectful. "Ma'am, I apologize for the late hour, but I needed to speak with you before tomorrow's formal proceedings." Carmen stepped aside to allow him entry, noting that his manner had transformed completely from the suspicious interrogation of previous encounters. He moved with the careful respect reserved for superior officers whose authority was unquestioned. "What can I do for you, Sergeant?" Morrison remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in formal military posture. "Ma'am, I wanted to offer a personal apology for my conduct during the past several weeks. My investigation of your background was appropriate in principle, but inappropriately persistent in execution." Carmen studied his expression, seeing genuine regret rather than professional obligation. "You were doing your job, Sergeant. Intelligence personnel are supposed to investigate inconsistencies." "But not to the point of harassment," Morrison replied, "and not without considering that some inconsistencies exist for legitimate operational reasons." The acknowledgement suggested Morrison understood that Carmen's background involved classified operations that justified the secrecy he'd been trying to penetrate. His apology was both personal and professional, recognition that he'd been pursuing information he wasn't cleared to access. "Your investigation skills are sound," Carmen said. "You identified real inconsistencies and pursued them through appropriate channels. The issue was that no normal channels existed for verification of my background." Morrison nodded. "Because you're not part of normal military structure?" Carmen didn't confirm or deny, but her silence was answer enough. Morrison had reached the correct conclusion about her status, and further discussion would venture into classified territory that neither of them could safely navigate. "Ma'am," Morrison continued, "there's something else I need to discuss. Word has spread throughout the base about today's events, and soldiers are asking questions about how they should interact with you going forward." Carmen realized the implications immediately. Her cover as custodial staff was completely destroyed, but her actual status remained classified. Base personnel were uncertain whether to treat her as civilian contractor, military officer, or something else entirely. What kind of questions? Questions about appropriate military courtesy, whether they should salute, use military address protocols, treat your instructions as orders rather than suggestions. Morrison paused. Questions about who you really are and what authority you actually possess. The situation was exactly what Carmen had hoped to avoid when accepting the custodial cover assignment. Her exposure during the crisis had created confusion about command structure and protocol that could affect base operations. "What would you recommend, Sergeant?" Morrison looked surprised by the question. "Ma'am, you understand military protocol and have observed my interactions with base personnel. How would you suggest handling the uncertainty about appropriate courtesy?" Morrison considered carefully before responding. "Ma'am, in my opinion, respect should be based on demonstrated competence and character, rather than rank or title. Today's events showed both, regardless of classification levels or official status." The response impressed Carmen with its thoughtfulness and maturity. Morrison had moved beyond his initial suspicion to recognize that authority could exist outside conventional military structure while still deserving recognition. "That's a reasonable approach," Carmen agreed, "but it doesn't resolve practical questions about command protocol and operational authority." Before Morrison could respond, another knock interrupted their conversation. Carmen glanced through the peephole to see Captain Santos and Lieutenant Martinez standing on her doorstep, both in dress uniforms and carrying formal expressions. Carmen opened the door to admit them, and all three soldiers immediately came to attention. The formal military courtesy felt strange after months of casual interaction, but Carmen realized it represented their attempt to show respect while navigating uncertain protocol. "At ease," Carmen said automatically, then caught herself. "Actually, please sit down. This is my personal quarters, not a command environment." The soldiers relaxed slightly, but remained formal as they settled into chairs around Carmen's small living room. Santos spoke first, her manner respectful but direct. "Ma'am, we've come to discuss tomorrow's proceedings and request guidance about ongoing operational matters." Carmen realized they were treating her as their commanding officer, despite the absence of formal rank structure or official authorization. The crisis had established her authority through competence rather than hierarchy, and they were seeking to maintain that relationship. "What proceedings are you referring to, Captain?" "Base Commander has scheduled formal debriefing at 0800 hours regarding today's emergency response," Santos replied. "Lieutenant Colonel Reeves wants complete after-action reports from all personnel involved in crisis coordination." Carmen understood the implications. Formal debriefing would require detailed discussion of her background and capabilities, information that couldn't be shared through normal military channels without proper clearances and authorization. "What specific information is he requesting?" Martinez consulted notes he'd brought with him. "Complete personnel background for all individuals who exercised coordination authority during the emergency, details about specialized training and authorization levels, source of technical expertise that prevented civilian casualties." The requirements would force disclosure of classified information unless Carmen could deflect the inquiry through appropriate channels. but doing so might compromise base personnel who had acted professionally and competently during the crisis. "Captain Santos," Carmen said carefully, "what's your assessment of today's emergency response from a military perspective?" Santos straightened, recognizing the request for professional analysis. "Ma'am, initial response procedures were inadequate for the specific crisis. Conventional emergency protocols would have resulted in civilian casualties through inappropriate evacuation routes and insufficient protection measures." Continue. "Specialized expertise provided by you prevented mass casualty event and enabled successful coordination with civilian emergency services. Without that expertise, we would have failed our mission to protect civilian population." Carmen nodded. "And your recommendation for after-action reporting?" Santos looked at Morrison and Martinez before responding. "Ma'am, we recommend focusing on operational procedures and outcomes rather than personnel background details. The success of emergency response should be measured by results achieved, rather than classification levels of individuals involved." The suggestion was both practical and protective. By emphasizing operational success rather than personnel details, they could satisfy debriefing requirements while avoiding classified information that might compromise Carmen's status. "That's a sound approach," Carmen agreed. "Focus on what was accomplished rather than who accomplished it." Morrison leaned forward slightly. "Ma'am, there's another issue we need to address. Base personnel are requesting guidance about ongoing interaction protocols with you." Carmen realized they were asking whether she would continue her custodial cover or assume different status on the installation. The question carried implications for command structure, operational authority, and her continued presence at Fort Braxton. "What kind of guidance are they seeking?" "Whether you'll be remaining at the installation," Martinez said. "Whether your role will change. Whether soldiers should continue treating you as civilian contractor or recognize different status." The questions reflected confusion that went beyond protocol to operational security. Carmen's exposure had created uncertainty that could affect base operations if not properly addressed. "My assignment status is under review," Carmen said carefully. "Until that review is completed, I recommend maintaining normal professional courtesy while avoiding unnecessary speculation about background or authority." Santos understood immediately. "Ma'am, you're asking us to treat today's events as operational success without pursuing details about how that success was achieved." "I'm asking you to focus on mission accomplishment rather than classified matters that don't affect your operational responsibilities," Carmen clarified. The distinction was important. Carmen was requesting operational security rather than personal privacy, protection of classified capabilities rather than individual reputation. Morrison stood, followed by the other soldiers. "Ma'am, we understand and will communicate appropriate guidance to base personnel." As they prepared to leave, Santos paused. "Ma'am, permission to speak freely?" Carmen nodded. Today's events demonstrated leadership and expertise that earned respect through actions rather than authority. Regardless of classification levels or official status, you have the confidence and support of personnel who witnessed your performance. The statement carried weight beyond formal courtesy. Santos was offering personal and professional respect that transcended rank structure or organizational hierarchy. "Thank you, Captain. That means a great deal." After they left, Carmen sat alone in her quarters, processing the day's transformation from invisible maintenance worker to recognized leader. Tomorrow would bring formal questioning that she'd need to navigate carefully, but tonight she realized something significant had changed in her relationship with Fort Braxton personnel. She'd earned their respect through competence under pressure, and they were offering loyalty that went beyond military obligation. It was a relationship she'd never expected to develop during what was supposed to be a routine cover assignment. The base commander's conference room at B-800 hours carried the weight of formal military proceedings, but with undercurrents of uncertainty that suggested this debriefing would venture beyond normal operational review. Lieutenant Colonel James Reeves sat at the head of the polished table, flanked by his staff officers, and facing the personnel who had managed the previous day's crisis response. Carmen entered the room in civilian clothes, dark slacks and a plain navy sweater, but her bearing was unmistakably military. She took the seat indicated by Colonel Reeves, aware that every officer present was studying her with curiosity that mixed professional interest with personal speculation about her background. "Before we begin," Reeves announced, "I want to acknowledge that yesterday's emergency response prevented what could have been a significant civilian casualty event. The coordination and expertise demonstrated by all personnel involved reflects well on Fort Braxton's operational capabilities." The opening statement was diplomatically phrased, but Carmen recognized its subtext. Reeves was praising operational success while positioning the debriefing as routine review rather than investigation of classified matters. "Ms. VALDEZ," Reeves continued, "your technical expertise during the chemical emergency was instrumental in successful crisis resolution. For the record, could you briefly outline your qualifications for chemical hazard assessment and emergency coordination?" The question was carefully worded to request information without demanding classified details, but Carmen realized any response would require discussion of capabilities that didn't match her official cover story. "Colonel, my background includes specialized training in hazardous materials assessment and crisis coordination procedures," she replied. "The specific training details remain classified under federal security provisions." Reeves nodded understanding. Military officers were accustomed to classification restrictions that limited discussion of operational capabilities, but Major Patricia Hendricks, the base intelligence officer, leaned forward with questions that suggested deeper investigation. "Ma'am, the technical procedures you implemented yesterday aren't covered in standard military training or civilian emergency response protocols. The atmospheric dispersion calculations and coordination procedures suggest specialized education or experience beyond conventional preparation." Carmen met Hendricks' gaze steadily. "Accurate assessment, Major. Could you be more specific about the source of that specialized preparation?" The direct question required careful handling. Carmen could deflect through classification claims, but doing so might suggest her presence at Fort Braxton involved ongoing intelligence activities rather than temporary cover assignment. "My background includes federal service and specialized communities that handle unconventional emergency situations," Carmen said. "The specific details require security clearances above base level for discussion." Captain Santos, seated across the table, recognized Carmen's diplomatic evasion and decided to support her position. "Colonel, if I may, yesterday's operational success was achieved through technical expertise and coordination capabilities. The source of that expertise is less important than the results accomplished." Reeves studied Santos with approval. "Agreed, Captain. Our focus should be on lessons learned and procedures for future emergency response." But Major Hendricks wasn't satisfied with operational review that avoided personnel background issues. As base intelligence officer, she was responsible for security assessment of all personnel with access to classified information or sensitive areas. "Colonel, with respect, Ms. VALDEZ demonstrated knowledge of communication protocols, technical procedures, and coordination authority that suggest current rather than former involvement with classified operations," Hendricks said. We need to understand her actual status and authority level. Carmen realized Hendricks was pursuing exactly the investigation she'd hoped to avoid. The major was connecting operational capabilities to current assignment rather than historical background, implications that could compromise ongoing security arrangements. Major Hendricks, Carmen said carefully. Some federal assignments include provision for discrete status during operational transitions. Discussion of those arrangements requires appropriate authorization levels. Hendricks leaned back, processing the response with professional interest. Are you suggesting your presence here involves current federal assignment rather than civilian employment? Before Carmen could respond, the conference room door opened and a figure entered, who immediately commanded attention from everyone present. Colonel Marcus Webb moved with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to controlling situations through presence rather than volume, and his arrival shifted the entire dynamic of the debriefing. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves, Webb said without preamble, I need to speak with Ms. VALDEZ regarding federal security matters. The rest of your staff should return to normal duties. Reeves stood immediately, recognizing authority that superseded his own. Yes, sir. Ma'am, personnel dismissed. As base officers filed out, Carmen remained seated while studying Webb with recognition that suggested previous contact. He was older than the other personnel, perhaps 55, with graying hair and expression that reflected years of managing classified operations. When the room emptied except for Webb and Carmen, he approached her position with respect that contrasted sharply with the earlier interrogative atmosphere. Carmen, he said, extending his hand. Good to see you again. Sorry about the circumstances. Carmen shook his hand with obvious familiarity. Marcus, I wasn't expecting direct intervention. Yesterday's events triggered automated notification protocols, Webb replied, taking a seat across from her. When personnel under federal protection exercise emergency authority, certain agencies receive immediate notification. Carmen understood immediately. Her crisis coordination had activated monitoring systems designed to track exposure of classified personnel and capabilities. How much oversight do we have? Webb consulted a secure communication device similar to the one Carmen had used during the emergency. Full operational review from 3 agencies. Your cover status is officially compromised, but yesterday's events justify the exposure under emergency protocols. What's the assessment? Successful completion of cover assignment with exemplary performance during unexpected crisis, Webb replied. Your evaluation of Fort Braxton security and personnel capabilities has been noted and appreciated. Carmen processed this information with relief. Her exposure hadn't created security complications, but had provided valuable assessment data about military installation readiness for unconventional emergencies. Personnel recommendations. Base commander and staff demonstrated competence and discretion during crisis involving classified capability, Webb said, recommended for enhanced security clearances and specialized training opportunities. The evaluation would benefit Fort Braxton personnel who had worked professionally with Carmen despite their confusion about her background and authority. What about ongoing assignment status? Webb smiled. That depends on your preferences. We have 3 options. Reassignment to different cover position, return to active operational status, or transition to training role for specialized emergency response. Carmen considered the alternatives. 8 months of custodial cover had provided valuable perspective on military installation operations, but yesterday's events had demonstrated that her expertise might be more valuable in direct application rather than covert observation. What kind of training role? Development and implementation of specialized emergency response protocols For military installations, Webb explained. Your experience with both covert operations and crisis management makes you uniquely qualified to prepare conventional military units for unconventional emergencies. The opportunity appealed to Carmen as a way to apply her expertise constructively while maintaining connection to the military community that had earned her respect during the crisis. Timeline for decision? No immediate pressure, Webb replied. Take time to consider options and discuss with relevant personnel if appropriate. Carmen understood that relevant personnel included the Fort Braxton officers who had supported her during the crisis and earned her professional respect through their competence and character. As Webb prepared to leave, he paused with additional information. Carmen, yesterday's events will be classified at levels that prevent detailed discussion, but the operational success will be recognized through appropriate channels. The personnel who worked with you have been commended for exceptional performance during crisis conditions. They deserve recognition, Carmen said. Their professionalism and adaptability prevented what could have been a disaster. Webb nodded. Agreed. It's unusual to find military personnel who can adapt to classified situations without compromising operational security or personal integrity. After Webb's departure, Carmen remained in the empty conference room, processing the day's revelations about her future options and the recognition that her temporary assignment had evolved into something more significant. Her cover as maintenance worker was permanently compromised, but the relationships she'd developed with Fort Braxton personnel had created opportunities that went beyond simple operational assignments. 3 weeks after the chemical emergency, Fort Braxton had settled into a new routine that reflected permanent changes in how personnel understood leadership, competence, and respect. Carmen VALDEZ no longer pushed a custodial cart through the corridors, but her presence remained felt throughout the installation in ways that went beyond formal authority or official position. She now occupied an office in the Strategic Planning Wing with a title that blandly described her role as Emergency Preparedness Coordinator while concealing the specialized expertise she brought to military readiness evaluation. The transformation from invisible maintenance worker to recognized consultant had been managed with diplomatic skill that protected classified details while acknowledging operational reality. Staff Sergeant Morrison found her reviewing base emergency protocols, her desk covered with technical manuals and assessment reports that reflected comprehensive analysis of Fort Braxton's preparedness for unconventional threats. The office bore traces of her previous precision, supplies organized with military efficiency, documents filed according to operational priority, everything positioned for maximum functionality. "Ma'am," Morrison said from the doorway, "permission to enter." Carmen looked up from protocol reviews with a smile that reflected comfortable working relationship rather than formal military courtesy. "Of course, Sergeant. What can I do for you?" Morrison approached with folder containing reports that had been requested as part of ongoing security assessment. Personnel background evaluations for the specialized emergency response team you recommended. All candidates have been cleared for enhanced training. Carmen accepted the folder, scanning the personnel files with professional interest. The emergency response team represented her primary contribution to Fort Braxton's improved readiness. Soldiers selected for their adaptability, analytical skills, and demonstrated competence under pressure. "Excellent choices," she said, reviewing the candidates. Captain Santos, Lieutenant Martinez, and Sergeant Rodriguez all showed exceptional performance during the crisis. Additional training will prepare them for scenarios that go beyond conventional emergency procedures. The team selection reflected Carmen's assessment of personnel who had earned her respect through their professional response to situations involving classified capabilities. Santos had adapted quickly to crisis coordination requirements. Martinez had implemented complex procedures without hesitation, and Rodriguez had overcome his initial skepticism to provide valuable operational support. "Ma'am, if I may ask, what kind of training will they receive?" Carmen looked at Morrison with evaluation that had become familiar to Fort Braxton personnel. Her responses to questions about specialized capabilities required careful balance between operational security and professional development. "Training in unconventional emergency response, crisis coordination procedures, and specialized threat assessment," she replied. "The goal is developing expertise that prepares military installations for scenarios that aren't covered in standard protocols." Morrison understood that her answer provided general categories without classified specifics, information that satisfied curiosity while protecting operational details that remained restricted. "Will you be conducting the training personally?" "Some aspects," Carmen said. "Other elements will be provided by specialists with relevant expertise. The training program is designed to develop institutional capabilities rather than dependence on individual knowledge." The approach reflected lessons learned from the chemical emergency, where specialized expertise had prevented disaster but also revealed dangerous gaps in conventional military preparedness for unconventional threats. Captain Santos appeared in the doorway, carrying reports that had been requested for the ongoing preparedness assessment. Her interaction with Carmen had evolved into professional partnership based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical authority. "Ma'am, emergency response coordination reports from neighboring installations," Santos said, entering the office. "Interesting patterns in preparedness levels and capability gaps." Carmen accepted the reports, immediately focusing on data that would inform her broader assessment of military readiness for specialized threats. Her analysis went beyond Fort Braxton to regional preparedness and national security implications of observed deficiencies. "What patterns are you seeing, Captain?" Santos consulted her notes, speaking with confidence that reflected enhanced training and expanded responsibilities. "Most installations have adequate protocols for conventional emergencies, but significant gaps in unconventional threat response. Chemical, biological, and cyber threats require capabilities that aren't included in standard military training." Recommendations? "Distributed training program that develops specialized expertise at multiple installations," Santos replied. "Rather than centralizing capabilities, create regional networks of personnel with enhanced training and coordination authority." Carmen nodded approval of the analysis. Santos had moved beyond implementation of procedures to strategic thinking about systematic improvements to military preparedness. "Sound approach. Have you discussed this with Lieutenant Colonel Reeves?" "Preliminary briefing scheduled for next week," Santos said. "He's been supportive of enhanced emergency preparedness since the chemical incident demonstrated our capability gaps." The conversation reflected broader changes at Fort Braxton that extended beyond emergency preparedness to institutional culture regarding competence, leadership, and respect. Carmen's revelation had influenced how personnel thought about authority and expertise in ways that improved overall operational effectiveness. Morrison lingered after Santos left, his expression suggesting he had additional matters to discuss that required privacy. "Ma'am, there's something else I wanted to mention," he said carefully. "Personnel throughout the base have been asking about appropriate protocols for interaction with you going forward." Carmen understood the issue immediately. Her transition from custodial staff to specialized consultant had created uncertainty about military courtesy and command relationships that affected daily interactions. "What specific questions?" whether military personnel should use formal address protocols, how to handle coordination authority during emergency situations, general questions about command structure when your expertise supersedes normal hierarchy. Morrison replied. The questions reflected practical challenges that arose when specialized expertise operated outside conventional military rank structure. Carmen's authority during the chemical crisis had been based on competence rather than hierarchy, creating precedent that required clarification for future situations. What would you recommend, Sergeant? Morrison considered his response carefully. Ma'am, in my opinion, respect and authority should be based on demonstrated competence and character rather than formal rank or title. Your performance during the crisis earned respect that goes beyond protocol requirements. But protocol still matters for institutional function, Carmen said. Soldiers need clear understanding of command relationships and authority structures. Agreed, ma'am. Perhaps the solution is recognizing that expertise can exist outside normal hierarchy while still requiring appropriate professional courtesy and coordination procedures. Carmen smiled at Morrison's thoughtful analysis. That's exactly the right approach, Sergeant. Competence and character earn respect, but institutions require clear protocols for operational effectiveness. The discussion reflected broader questions about how military organizations could adapt to incorporate specialized expertise that didn't fit conventional rank structures while maintaining institutional effectiveness. Sergeant Morrison, Carmen continued, your analytical skills and professional development over the past month have been impressive. Have you considered opportunities for enhanced training or expanded responsibilities? Morrison straightened with interest. Ma'am, I would be honored by opportunities to develop additional capabilities that serve the installation's mission. I'll speak with Lieutenant Colonel Reeves about advanced training opportunities that would utilize your intelligence background and analytical skills, Carmen said. The Enhanced Emergency Response Program needs personnel who can think beyond conventional procedures. As Morrison left her office, Carmen returned to her assessment reports with satisfaction that went beyond successful completion of cover assignment. Her time at Fort Braxton had created relationships and institutional improvements that would continue benefiting installation readiness and personnel development. The morning routine she'd established as custodial staff continued in modified form. She still paused at the memorial wall each day, but now her presence there drew respectful acknowledgement from passing soldiers rather than casual dismissal. The names she honored remained the same, but her connection to their legacy had been publicly recognized rather than privately maintained. Lieutenant Martinez found her there during one of these morning observances, his approach respectful but comfortable rather than formal. Ma'am, morning briefing materials for the emergency response team, he said, offering a folder of training documents. Carmen accepted the materials while continuing her silent recognition of memorial names. How is team preparation progressing, Lieutenant? Excellent response from all personnel, Martinez replied. Enhanced training in crisis coordination and unconventional threat assessment has been well received. Personnel appreciate understanding capabilities they didn't know existed. Good. The goal is developing institutional knowledge rather than individual expertise dependencies. Martinez nodded, understanding. Ma'am, if I may, the team wanted me to express their appreciation for the training opportunities and professional development you've made possible. Carmen turned from the memorial to face him directly. Lieutenant, the opportunities were earned through professional competence and character demonstrated during crisis conditions. Recognition and advancement came through merit, not favoritism. Understood, ma'am, but the opportunities might not have existed without your assessment and recommendation. The acknowledgement reflected broader appreciation throughout Fort Braxton, for Carmen's influence on personnel development and institutional improvement. Her recommendations had created advancement opportunities that might not have been available through conventional channels. As weeks passed, the story of the custodial worker who revealed herself during crisis became part of Fort Braxton's institutional memory. But the details took on mythic quality that emphasized lessons about respect, competence, and leadership rather than specific operational capabilities. New personnel arriving at the installation heard stories about the importance of treating all personnel with respect, regardless of their apparent position or background. The tale of Carmen VALDEZ became a cautionary reminder that competence could exist in unexpected places and that true leadership was demonstrated through character under pressure rather than rank or title. Carmen's office became a destination for soldiers seeking guidance about professional development, crisis preparedness, and leadership principles. Her door remained open to personnel at all levels who wanted to discuss career advancement, training opportunities, or operational challenges. The relationships she'd developed during her cover assignment had evolved into mentoring connections that benefited individual personnel and institutional effectiveness. Her expertise in specialized operations provided perspective on military service that went beyond conventional training and experience. On a quiet Friday evening, as Carmen finished reviewing training reports and preparedness assessments, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred since the chemical emergency. Her assignment to Fort Braxton had been intended as temporary cover between operational deployments, but it had evolved into something more meaningful. She had discovered satisfaction in developing institutional capabilities rather than conducting individual operations. Teaching emergency preparedness and crisis coordination provided opportunities to share expertise while building lasting improvements to military readiness. The relationships she'd formed with Fort Braxton personnel had created professional connections based on mutual respect and shared commitment to excellence. Santos, Martinez, Morrison, and others had become colleagues whose competence and character made working together genuinely rewarding. Her reflection was interrupted by a knock at the office door. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves stood in the doorway with expression that mixed formal military bearing with personal respect that had developed over their weeks of working together. "Carmen, do you have a moment?" She gestured for him to enter, noting that he'd used her first name rather than formal address, a level of familiarity that reflected their evolved professional relationship. "Colonel, what can I do for you?" Reeves took a seat across from her desk, his manner suggesting this conversation involved personal rather than official business. "I wanted to discuss your long-term assignment status and express Fort Braxton's interest in making your position here permanent." Carmen looked at him with surprise. She had assumed her specialized consultant role would be temporary, lasting only until enhanced emergency preparedness procedures were fully implemented. "I appreciate the confidence, Colonel, but my background typically involves assignments of limited duration." "I understand," Reeves replied, "but your contribution to this installation has gone beyond specialized expertise to institutional improvement that would benefit from continuity. The emergency response program, personnel development initiatives, and preparedness assessment have created capabilities that require ongoing oversight and development." Carmen considered the offer carefully. Permanent assignment would represent significant change from the operational lifestyle she'd maintained for years, but it would also provide opportunities to build lasting improvements rather than managing temporary solutions. What would permanent assignment involve? Development and implementation of regional emergency preparedness program, coordination with multiple installations, training development for specialized response capabilities, Reeves explained. Essentially expanding what you've accomplished here to broader military readiness improvement. The scope of responsibility appealed to Carmen as opportunity to apply her expertise constructively while maintaining connection to military communities that had earned her respect and loyalty. Timeline for decision? No immediate pressure, Reeves said, but I wanted you to know that the option exists and that Fort Braxton would consider your permanent presence a significant asset to our operational capabilities. After Reeves left, Carmen sat alone in her office, considering options that represented fundamental choice about her future direction. The operational lifestyle that had defined her adult life offered excitement and challenge, but the institutional development work at Fort Braxton provided satisfaction that came from building lasting improvements rather than managing temporary crises. She looked around the office that had become familiar workspace, then at the reports and assessment documents that represented ongoing projects with personnel who had become trusted colleagues. Outside her window, the base continued its evening routine with efficiency and purpose that reflected institutional strength built through dedication and competence of individual personnel. Carmen realized she had found something at Fort Braxton that she hadn't expected, a sense of belonging to community whose values and mission aligned with her own commitment to service and excellence. The decision about permanent assignment could wait, but Carmen understood that her time as invisible maintenance worker had ended permanently. She had been revealed as someone whose expertise and character demanded recognition, and she had discovered satisfaction in relationships based on mutual respect rather than operational necessity. Whether her future involved continued service at Fort Braxton or different assignments, the relationships and institutional improvements she had created would continue benefiting military readiness and personnel development. The woman who had once cleaned floors while concealing extraordinary capabilities had become a recognized leader whose influence would shape military emergency preparedness for years to come. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep the courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us where you are watching from and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget.